Hello, everyone. I hope you had a great break. I just wanted to give you some quick context for looking at what will be our next topic in class, looking at the Abbasid Empire and especially the House of Wisdom. Just wanted to remind you that and this goes back to the visual assignment that you did some time ago. You were looking at some of the differences between the Umayyads and the Abbasids, and the Abbasids come to power in 750. Both the Umayyads and the Abbasids are Sunni dominated, but the Abbasids will be very different, especially in a political sense and maybe in terms of some priorities. Both of the Umayyads and the Abbasids have a very, very notable trade and really extensive long-distance trade. So there's a great deal of goods, including food and grains, that are traveling across the entire empire. There's common currency in both these cases for the most part, unless societies are fragmenting apart. But for the most part, we see a lot of strong economic ideas in both the Umayyads and the Abbasids. What will be significantly different becomes the political structure of the Abbasids for a couple of reasons. So that's what's highlighted in this, and also gives you a setup for some of the way in which the priorities are really different in the Abbasid dynasty, especially regarding scholarship. So keep in mind that Abu al-Abbas is one of the individuals, but there are many who really lead a revolt against the Umayyad. This is really an alliance group, essentially, of Shia Muslims, also Persians who are not included in the Umayyad, kind of political hierarchy. They don't get the highest level jobs. So there's a lot of dissatisfied individuals, including people who see the Umayyads as maybe disregarding some of the values of Islam. So the Abbasids really become part of a revolution. There's like a large-scale revolutionary effort, and the Abbasids, Abu al-Abbas, and some of the individuals who become kind of the first leaders are probably most known because they have a family connection to Muhammad. Despite that, they're still considered Sunni and will become Sunni Islam leaders, but have a huge following and recognition because they have a family line to Muhammad. One of the things that's most different once the Abbasids come to power in 750, we see Persians in particular being very encouraged to participate actively in government, as early as 750 and 800. Remember that non-Arabs were not included in the highest positions. There was kind of this military Arabic, role for the conquerors in the Umayyad society. That is a lot less the case, and this is much less of a militaristic run society. This is now going to be much more administrative, and the Abbasid rulers will see themselves as largely ruling from an urban center, which will be Baghdad. The city of Baghdad, the second caliph of the Abbasids, is going to set up the planned city of Baghdad. It probably reaches its height under the rule of Caliph Harun al-Rashid around the early 800s. Okay, the caliph's position also becomes a little bit more significant under the Abbasids, although in time, by the 1000s, there will be a reduction in effective power of the caliphs. But the caliph is seen in a sense as a deputy of God, and the structure for the caliph's court becomes much more enhanced, much more ceremonial, much more kind of adherence to certain protocols in terms of how to treat the caliph, and the caliph's court is kind of a very special happening. The provincial leaders that are around the entire empire are considered emirs and actually have a great deal of independence. So on one hand, you can argue that this is a centralized state that has a centralized currency, that has rules for the way trade is going to evolve, but at the same time, there's also a great deal of hands-off kind of leadership. This is because Baghdad is really far away from some parts of the empire, including like northern Africa, and we see some of the emirs really establishing their own party base. And by the 900s, and maybe even as early as the 700s, we have emirs breaking away from the Abbasids. So if you were to look at a map of the entire Abbasid kingdom, over time, the entire empire, it would just continuously get smaller and smaller and smaller, because basically different people are kind of refusing to adhere to the caliph's rules, or refusing to adhere to the common currency. There's also new positions, so there's a hierarchy in the Abbasids. There's an assistant to the caliph, the vizier. This is somebody who has really significant power, in some cases even inherits like a power base of their own. And there is also kind of an increase in the development of Sharia law. This is this almost like precedent-based body of law decisions based on scholars known as ulama and the qadis, who are judges. So when people are unsure about whether something is maybe fitting to do according to the principles in the Quran, they might ask a scholar or be ruled on by a qadi. And the way that the rulings kind of become interpreted help to create essentially a common law. So there is Sharia law, although interpretations of Sharia do lead to some different descriptions of the law at various points in time. So some of you noted in your benchmarks, for example, that the role of women changes between, say, early in the development of the Islamic Empire, where we have the Quran maybe arguably increasing rights for women compared to the time before the Quran, but later in the Abbasids, we see some reduction in rights for women. Some of that might be due to interpretations that are new kind of human interpretations of what the Quran says regarding patriarchy, role of men, and role of women. So it's a very nuanced type of thing in terms of some of the gender roles. Also note that some gender roles tend to be culturally based. Sometimes in these new Islamic societies, we see cultural practices that had been practiced, say, for example, in Byzantine, starting to become popular in Islamic society. So some of the practices that affect women are not necessarily all first and foremost related to the Quran or interpretation of the Quran. Some of the practices are also cultural and have other influences and roots. And because the empire is so large, the treatment of women can vary. But we can say, in general, there are changes to the way Sharia law might affect the people living in the Abbasid Empire. There's also madrasas, essentially colleges. We can certainly argue there's a great deal of schooling for younger kids as well. As early as 5, boys are being taught to learn not only to memorize the Quran. Oftentimes, one's education would start that way. Once one would memorize parts of the Quran, then somebody might actually move up. And the way that education worked in Islamic society is kind of very interesting. There is a very tight relationship between teacher and student, so that the teacher would select works for the student to consider, the student would consider the works, and when the student has read the works, understood the works, written about the works, the teacher essentially signs off that the student is now capable of teaching those same works. So students, in a sense, become qualified to do other things based on their teachers. And so the key in Islamic society was to find like a really good teacher. That was kind of the way that this rolled, and most teachers were part of a Islamic religious group. So a big part of the madrasas is religious in nature, but people are also learning a great deal of things outside of religion and the Quran, including mathematics, science, and other types of topics. Okay, there's a great deal of administrative priorities. I know the Bentley text tells us that. What is it that might mean? Consider administrative priorities is really focusing on how to best govern a very large-scale empire. Some very key things that were done in administrative might have been some irrigation projects, because there's some areas which are inherently more fertile than others. There's a huge effort to move around water in this entire empire. So there's a great deal of the kind of money that's coming from the state to actually deal with irrigation projects. There's also a lot of bookkeeping efforts and record keeping. Some of this is very noteworthy. For example, in patients who are hospitalized, hospitals are an like brand new in the Islamic Empire, but there's a lot of hospitals built in the Islamic Empire and a great deal of advancements made to the concepts of hospitals in this time, right? Byzantine had previously had a hospital system, much less so the projects in Western Europe, but we see record keeping and patient records and common doctors, something that's kept in the Islamic Empire. There is a large scale effort to create science and aspects of literature. Much of this is very connected to Islam and the Quran. So we see a great deal of poetry, for example, from Sufis who are experiencing the Quran not through Sharia law and kind of the rules of what to do or what not to do, but through a very spiritual, emotional kind of connection with Allah. Some of that would be an example of some poetry that might be linked to the Quran. In the case of science, a great deal of effort in astronomy and astrology is focused so that there can be better access to knowing the times of day for prayer, knowing some specific things in terms of dating. There's a great deal of effort to try to ensure access to some of the practices in Islam through mathematics and science. A couple of other things to note is that culturally and also politically, there's a huge context for slavery in the Abbasid Empire. It's not new in the Abbasid Empire, but it's interesting in that there's a great number of Turks who are new to the area of the Abbasid Empire. There's a large-scale migration that happens in a couple of different ways of Turkic peoples, and the migration increases after the Battle of Manzikert, when there actually is kind of an opening up of the Byzantine Empire, formally had controlled Anatolia. It becomes attacked by the Seljuk Turks, and the opening up of Anatolia, which is kind of modern day Turkey, lends itself to a great population increase of Turks. And we see similarly in Persia lots of Turks, in some cases migrating in some cases being enslaved. Initially, Muslims were not enslaving other Muslims, so there was always an interest in purchasing slaves from outside of the society, and Turks were seen as having good military capability. In time, a large number of Turks will actually become or convert to Islam. So we see kind of a Anatolian society develop with a Turkish ethnicity, Turkish language, and Islam as the religion, largely Sunni Islam. And this will kind of become, in time, the dominant place for the Ottoman Empire. Similarly, in Persia, we have a Persian language, Persian ethnicity, and also Islam. Eventually, we will see more domination of Shia Islam and something known as the Safavid Empire. So future in the map, we kind of see a distinction between Sunni and Shia in the area that we're kind of highlighting earlier in time. The other thing about the Abbasids, and the Abbasids formally end in the 1200s, it's really in this time period of about maybe 1000 or 1100 where we have that large-scale Turkish migration that we start to see, the reduction of Abbasid power. But the other thing to kind of note is that there are large numbers of Christians and Jews, and even when we look at the House of Wisdom in the idea of scholarship and the priority of learning, something that's key about that is to understand that lots of the people who are participating in scholarship and in other capacities too throughout the Islamic Empire are not Muslim. You have Muslims and Jews and Christians, and so in a lot of cases we're looking at Arabic speakers who are involved in a large-scale translation movement to get scribed texts from ancient Greek and Indian into not Indian language, but Indian texts from, say, Hindi, getting some of the Syriac texts, a variety of different texts translated into Arabic. A lot of this is happening because Christians and Jews are also participating. So it's important to kind of keep in mind that the population in the Islamicate is really, very, very ethnically and religiously diverse. Okay, and this is Baghdad, probably the most diverse of all cities, very cosmopolitan. You can see that it is round. It is also completely filled with water. You can see the Tigris River here. And all of the tributaries that are significant. Much of this would be man-made, so all of the districts around Baghdad would be teeming with water, would give it a great deal of fertility, and there are different districts with different gates, different groups of people living throughout Baghdad, probably around 900. This round city would have a population of about maybe 1 million or so. You can see the dating here after the Hijra. This is the date on the map.